Well, good evening, everybody. Good evening, good evening, good evening. Coach Sherri, Chaplain Sherri, your community pastor Sherri, Sherri from the 800 block of Mooney Avenue. Good evening as we are exploring the fourth and the final installment of our Advent season that the Preachers Academy has hosted and sponsored and facilitated during this season. It has been a blessing. If you have been here all 4 weeks, please let me know. And also let me know if this has been a blessing to you, because it is a blessing for me. Good evening, Pastor Bianca. So glad that you are here tonight. It's in some things I just hold to, and Advent is one of the things that I hold true to. And because for several reasons, Advent for me allows me to step back and to not get caught up in the frenzy of Christmas and miss Christmas, because there are many times that the church that I found, we major in a lot of programs that are not beneficial, and then we miss the holy seasons, the seasons of the church. And so that's why it is important for me to observe Advent in a real way. So this is the fourth and final installment of this 4-week series, Advent Anticipating Light and Liberation. On the first week, we had Dr. Garland Thompson with me, and we looked at Hagar and Mary, right? We looked at Hagar and Mary. And then the second week, Reverend Marilyn Smith was with me, and we included Sarah and Elizabeth in that journey, in that portion of it. And last week, Reverend Margaret Conley was with me. And tonight, we are going to round this off by looking at Hannah and Mary. And Dr. Will Gaffney, in her women's lectionary, does a good job of tying Mary back to women of old, right? That Mary is not the first woman to bear or bring forth a holy child. And that's what we're going to see tonight as we are looking at Hannah, as we are looking at Hannah. So if you are just joining me, please come in. Let me know where you are joining me from. It's going to be me tonight. We're going to round this up. And so what I need for you to do, as they say in church, if you give me your amens, then I am going to do my best to give you the word concerning our as we're leading up to Christmas, right? Because Christmas does not start. Christmas, we are not in the Christmas season yet. Christmas starts December 25th. Right now, we are still in Advent. We are still in Advent. So tonight, we want to focus on God's partnership with women, and how God worked through Hannah and Mary, because both of these women, though in different time periods, different stations in life, they have one thing in common: that God chose them, God commissioned them for a particular work, and they cooperated with God, right? They entered into partnership with God to bring forth a holy child that would change the world. Now we know that in Mary's case, she was drafted, she was told, she was voluntold, as they say, that she was going to do this. And I want to make sure that we know and that we understand that we are not talking about a woman. We are talking about a teenager. We're talking about a teenager about 13 and 14 years old. So our text tonight, our point of departure text include Hannah's story in 1 Samuel 1, 9 through 20, and also Mary's story. Of course, we're going to go back to Luke 1, 26 through 38 and 46 through 45. And so we're going to compare these stories. We're going to compare these women and the work that they did. The work that they did. Both Hannah and Mary are pivotal. They are important women in Scripture. They were chosen by God to bring forth sons who will transform their communities and advance God's purpose. It is very important that we understand that the work that these women did, right? Because it was work. God enlisted their wombs, right? And Dr. Gaffney uses the term that womb slave, right? The womb slave. They were forced into this labor to bring forth these sons, but their sons would change the communities in which they lived and beyond their communities. That's very important. So let's step back and take a look at Hannah first. Let's look at Hannah first. And again, her story is in 1 Samuel 1, 9 through 20. If you're just coming in, would you like, share, tag, do all of those things? Invite other people as you are finding value. Invite other people in your circle, your clique, or your crew, because we all influence other people. We all pastor somebody. So when we look at Hannah's story, it's very important to understand that Hannah was barren and she was deeply distressed by it. Now that's very important. She was barren and she was deeply distressed by that. And we're going to talk about what may have been the cause of this distress, right? What may have been the cause of this distress? Now we understand Hagar's story. She was not barren. She was brought into a situation because Sarah, her mistress, so to speak, brought her into the situation because Sarah was barren, right? Elizabeth was barren. Mary was not barren, but the way that her child came about, right? She has her own story, her own moments of distress and anxiety and worry. But Hannah was barren and she was distressed, which caused her to go into deep prayer, asking God, right, to relieve her of this, to allow her to bring forth a child. So she poured out her soul. She went in prayer she prayed in the temple, and she wanted a child so bad until she said, God, if you give me this child, I'll give the child back to you. If you give me this child, she made a vow, right? She made a vow that, in other words, she bargained with God. And how many times have we bargained with God to say, if you do this, then I will do A, B, and C. And sometimes we don't follow through, even when God follows through. Sometimes we don't follow through, even when God follows through. And so she prayed, she asked God for a son. And the text says that God hears her and grants her a son, and the son is Samuel, who will grow up to be a prophet and a judge in Israel. So there are some key things that we can learn about Hannah: that she was persistent and she held her faith in the midst of her adversity. She went to God because she believed that God would grant her this child. I want to talk about what may have been the cause of this distress. And I know that we've talked about barrenness and not being able to have children and how that was frowned upon. But I want us to really dive into that a little bit more, because in the biblical world, in the ancient world, the importance of women birthing children and the society's stigma against barrenness were deeply rooted in cultural, economic, and religious realities. Did you hear that? Cultural, economics, and religious. These are the three reasons, or the three things that cause women to be in distress when they could not bring forth children. Children were a source of economic and social stability. This was an agricultural world. They needed bodies. They needed bodies to work the fields. I need us to catch this. They needed bodies to work the fields. It was a matter of economics. They needed workers. And so children were vital, free labor for farming and herding. Now, this was not, like we're going to plan families and, we want children because we just love children so much. No, they were labor for the fields, for herding. So a large family provided stability, security, and get this, for family lineage. In other words, when the parents became older, their children were obligated to care for them. And so children, especially sons, were necessary not only to care for the parents, older parents, but also to carry on the family's name and to preserve land and wealth within a family or tribe. Without heirs, the property will be lost to other families. right? So this is real. These are not just large families because they love children so much and they just wanted to provide for lots of children. No, it is because from an economic standpoint, it is because of a lineage standpoint that they're to keep the land in the family, to keep the wealth in the family. Children were necessary. Children were necessary. And so if a woman could not bring children, could not birth children, it was seen as that woman failing to live up to her part of bringing children who would contribute to the family's economic and social stability. Now, I understand that this is not sexy talk tonight, but I'm trying to help us to understand how God moved and worked through these women whose society looked down on, and the women were considered failures. Now, I need to just step back to say that this is not just a biblical world stigma, it is a right now 21st century stigma. For women who either choose not to have children or who cannot have children, it is still a stigma. Ask me how I know. It is still a stigma. And so if you think, or if we think this whole fight about abortion is just to bring the children, not to kill the children, it is that, but it is also so families, certain races of families can have children who will replicate themselves, if you know what I'm talking about. And so it is still a stigma. I can't tell you how many times people will ask, well, what's wrong with you? Or they will look down at you with pity. Oh, poor you. So there is still a stigma when it comes to women choosing not to have children or cannot have children. A woman's identity and social status, catch this, a woman's identity and social status was tied to her ability to have children. Now, I'm going somewhere tonight because we are talking about a holy child born through a woman. I want to set up, and I'm trying to set up why it is of much importance that God would use these barren women who were marginalized, who were looked down on, because they could not have children. They were seen as failures. A woman's identity and social stability was tied to her ability to have children. Her primary role in a patriarchal society was to marry and bear children. Her identity is tied to whether or not she can fulfill her primary role. Motherhood was seen as a woman's highest calling and a measure of her worth. Again, we don't want to just leave this in the pages of the biblical text, because today there is still, and for many women who cannot have children, they see themselves as, who am I? Why can't I do this? What's wrong with me? Who's going to want me? Because society still sees women as her primary role is to marry and have children. Fertility was seen as a divine blessing, because a woman who had children was honored and respected in her community, while a barren woman was often pitied, shamed, or considered cursed. Let's hear this again. She was pitied, she was shamed, or she was considered cursed. And so women were looked down on because she was seen as failing her fundamental role. And this could lead to social isolation and being an outcast and being ridiculed, or even her husband taken up, as they say, with another woman. And so we understand the story of Sarah, and we give her a bad name, and we speak ill of her for telling Abram to get Hagar. But I want to show us tonight what could have led to her doing it. Right? We can say all of the things that we want to say based upon our 21st century understanding. But unless you get into the world of the text, we miss some important life details. We miss some of life's important life details when we don't get in the world of the text. And so this is what Hannah is up against in 1 Samuel. And we know the story of her and Peninnah, the feud and things of that nature. We know that. But so it is with this in mind that she prayed and asked God to give her a son. And so now that we see what she was up against, perhaps she was tired of going to the city gates and hearing the other women choo-choo about her. Perhaps she was tired of feeling like a failure, that she couldn't do the thing that she was put on earth to do. At least what society told her, that she was only worth something if she could bring forth a child. But the biblical record shows that God heard her prayer and granted her a son. And granted her a son. Now, when we get to Mary's story, right? When we get to Mary's story, Mary is a young woman of low status. She gets the announcement, the annunciation. We've gone through that. Unlike Hannah, who is seeking a child, Mary is not seeking a child, right? Mary is not seeking a child. She is engaged to Joseph. She's just doing what she's doing, and God chooses her. God chooses her. Hannah prays for a child, and Mary is chosen. Mary is chosen. God's favor rests on Mary. And we know the end of the story, that she responds and she says, let it be so. Let it be so. Let it be so. So now I want to go back. Because it is under these conditions, that Hannah is enduring, and God hears her prayer and grants her prayer, which shows that God hears the prayers of women, that God hears our cries. When society silences us and marginalizes us and tell us that we are not worth anything, that God hears us and God honors us, even when society says we ain't worth nothing. That's good news tonight, that God hears us and God honors us. And even more so, God is a listener, but God is also a collaborator, God partners with women. God partners through women to bring forth justice, renewal, and salvation. God partners with women. God partners with the marginalized to bring forth justice, renewal, and salvation. And also, God serves as an advocate. God shows up as an advocate to disrupt societal norms. God shows up and disrupts the naysayers and disrupts what society says is no good. Hannah's being barren and Mary being of lowly estate, that God empowers them to disrupt, to do what society says they cannot do. I don't know how this is speaking to you tonight, but it is speaking to me that despite what systems and despite what patriarchal practices, despite any of that, that God sees, God hears, and God acts. God sees, God hears, and God acts. Now let's look at these songs. Let's look at both of these songs. We're gonna look at the songs for Mary, and for Hannah. So Hannah's song is in 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel 1. Because they're in both of these songs, in Mary's song and Hannah's song, will be some similarities, right? It will be some similarities. Let's look at Hannah's song. Well, Hannah's song actually starts in chapter 2. Chapter 2:1, where her prayer, which is in the form of a song, it says, "Then Hannah prayed, my heart rejoices to God. My strength rises up in the Lord. My mouth mocks my enemies because I rejoice in your deliverance. No one is holy like the Lord, no one except you. There is no rock like our God." Don't go on and on talking so proudly, spouting arrogance from your mouth, because the Lord is the God who knows, and he weighs every act. Verse 4. The bows of mighty warriors are shattered. I want you to catch this language, right? I want you to catch this language. I want you to catch the language. But those who were stumbling now dress themselves in power. Those who were full now sell themselves for bread. But the ones who were starving are now fat from food. The woman who was barren has birthed 7 children. But the mother with many sons has lost them all. Are you hearing this language? Because this language is familiar and sounds familiar to Mary's song. Sounds familiar to Mary's song. The Lord, he brings death, gives life, takes down to the grave and raises up. The Lord, he makes poor, gives wealth, brings low, but also lifts up high. God raises the poor from the dust, lifts up the needy from the garbage pile. God sits them with officials, give them the seats of honor. The pillars of the earth belong to the Lord. He sets the world on top of them. God guards the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked die in darkness because no one succeeds by strength alone. Hannah's song, just like Mary's song, sees and envisions a future where God will turn the world right side up. That God will disrupt systems where the first shall be last and the last shall be first. We've kind of like gone over Mary's song, but I want us to look at both of these songs. Both of these songs. The theme of Hannah's song, Mary's song, is uplifting the lowly and the marginalized. Uplifting the lowly and the marginalized. Both of them. Feeding the hungry, overthrowing the proud and the powerful, extending God's mercy, faithfulness to God's covenant, In Hannah's song, she says, those who were feel full now will sell themselves to bread for bread. In other words, there's coming a time when those who are fat now, those are rich now, will become poor. Those who were stumbling will dress themselves in power. She sees a future, and the future looks so much better. Which is the same thing that Mary sang about. Hannah's song is a hymn of praise and thanksgiving to God. And it is filled with all of these themes that highlight God's sovereignty and highlights God's justice and care for the marginalized. In her song, there's rejoicing in God's deliverance. She begins by rejoicing in the Lord for answering her prayer and granting her a son. And then she talks about God's holiness. And then verses 3 through 8, God's justice for the oppressed is a central theme of the song. As she talks about God's power to reverse human circumstances. This is what Hannah envisions and what she sees. That God is the giver and the sustainer of life. That God exalts the humble and opposes the proud. Which is the same thing as the holy child that Mary was carrying. So Hannah's song is a profound celebration of God's power, God's justice, and faithfulness. There are themes of reversal, justice, and divine sovereignty. That Mary sings about these same things. And we see that this holy child that Mary is going to bring forth, that Jesus will fulfill those things. And so the child that Hannah will have, Samuel, will serve as a prophet, who will serve the people well. He serves as a prophet who will anoint kings and bring spiritual renewal to Israel. His life reflects God's faithfulness to Hannah. Hannah prayed and said, if you give me this child, I'm going to give him back to you. And she dedicates her child to divine service. And Jesus, the Messiah, will do the work that Mary envisioned. He's going to overthrow societal norms. He's going to liberate the oppressed and bring justice and peace. So as we go into what we call Christmas Day, I want to remind us that this holy child, Jesus, came into this world with a job. A job that was prophesied, a job that his mother, and you know, the more I've been going through this and going through and focusing on Mary, I believe that God honored, that the work that Jesus did honored his mother. And it is fulfillment of the vision that she had that was beyond her, that she understood that being favored was not just about her. Because the things that Jesus did for having compassion for the poor, for being associated with outcasts, for feeding the hungry physically and spiritually, because we know about what he did with the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000, and we know he declared himself as being the bread of life. He also fulfilled overthrowing the powerful and the proud. He critiqued. He did not align himself. This baby, this holy child is born from the lowly, was born and raised on the bad side of the tracks, to poor people in poverty. Jesus did not sell out his gifts to align himself with the rich and powerful. He critiqued. He challenged the hypocrisy and the corruption of the religious leaders. If you read Matthew 23, where Jesus calls them vipers and tells them, you can know all the law, the scriptures, but if you are not practicing what you preach, you are like whitewashed tombs, looking good on the outside, but dead on the inside, worthless. He condemns those who exploit the poor. He reverses power structure by teaching that greatness comes through service and not domination. That service comes through, that greatness comes through service and not domination. He extends God's mercy. Mary sang about that in Luke 1:50. His mercy extends to those who fear him from generation to generation. And how did Jesus do that? Through healing and forgiveness. He demonstrates through healing the sick, forgiving and restoring people to wholeness. He welcomes the Gentiles, the outsiders. He expands the scope of God's grace and mercy to those outside of Israel. You see, this baby boy, this holy child that will come through the womb of this young girl, came with purpose. And I want to add tonight that every baby that enters this world is born with purpose. It doesn't matter the circumstances of the birth. It does not matter who the parents are. It doesn't matter the social, economic status. That through these women, we see that God partners with the least, the last, and the unlikely. Which means that God will partner with you. Which means that God will work through you if you avail yourself. And so, as we are ending this Advent season, this holy child that will come will bring light and liberation in the most dire circumstances. And so, as you get to Christmas and you are gathered with family and you are gathered with friends and you're doing all of the things, may you be reminded of this season, this that we have been anticipating and we have been waiting for, the day of the birth, not just for the gifts or all of that, but because the child who was promised is here to do the work. Now, what does that mean for us? That after December 25th, the work of Christmas should continue. For those of us who are Jesus followers, if Jesus' work is to be fulfilled, if Mary's vision is to come to pass, it must come through our hands, our feet, and our mouths. Which means that we ought to be speaking the same language and we ought to be doing the same work as Jesus. Uplifting the lowly and marginalized, feeding the hungry, overthrowing the proud and powerful, extending God's mercy, being faithful to God and God's ways. If we are Jesus followers, this is the work of Christmas. This is the work of Christmas. And so, as we prepare to leave this season of Advent, may we always remember the work that Jesus came to do. And although we'll see the manger and we'll see the nativity scene, please understand that Jesus is no longer a baby. That he grew up to do the work that Mary saw him do long before he did it. Y'all be blessed. May your Christmas be all that you want it to be, but remember, there's work to do. May all be well with your day.